Welcome to the Know Your Legacy podcast. I'm your host, Vipul Basania, and today's guest is Mastin Kipp. Mastin is an entrepreneur, life coach, speaker, and best-selling author. His inspirational website, thedailylove.com, was born out of his own search for love and meaning, which spiraled into becoming one of the biggest personal development companies that holds retreats and seminars around the world. He's also the host of the Mastin Kipp podcast and is the creator of something called functional life coaching, which serves to transform the way that you believe things about your life so that you can change the way that you approach it. Oprah calls him the thought leader of our generation for the next level of spiritual thinkers. So Mastin, thank you so much for being here.
Via, it's a pleasure to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Oh, most definitely. As we were saying off air, it's been about 6 months, so it's about time, and I'm pumped to bring some value to the audience, man. So
I'm excited.
Looking into your story, there's so much. And I think people who haven't heard of you before or your work, I think it's probably best to start off with putting some context behind all that. And I guess the lens that I want to do it through is you've talked about man's search for meaning quite a few times before, and having a compelling vision. And I think if you start with talking about the compelling vision that you had for your life at the very beginning and how that, I guess, changed over time to bring you to where you are now.
Yeah, invoking Viktor Frankl is a beautiful and sacred thing to do. Viktor Frankl went through the Holocaust. He was in Auschwitz, and he lost most of his family. And he wrote extensively about his learning at Auschwitz in terms of, because he was a psychologist, and understanding about like what is it like to be in a traumatizing environment and how do you get through it. Logotherapy and his whole process is an amazing addition to the field. And I don't think anyone in modern society has much of a context of how traumatizing that must have been. But one of the things that Frankl talks about is that you have to have something to hold on to. Because when he was in Auschwitz, he would see like certain people, regardless of the same malnourishment, et cetera. But some people wouldn't make it, and some people would. And he basically found that the people who did make it, had a vision, right? Like you're talking about, of like a vision to hold on to. And whether or not they thought it was going to happen or not, they had something outside themselves. And that's a really powerful lesson. When you start talking about people like Viktor Frankl, or you just see a quote on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, you kind of like it and you move on. But you have to understand like where that advice comes from is like some of the depths of human suffering. And it's really good advice that we can apply in day-to-day life. And I can't say that I've always had a vision, but what I can say is that through my life, when I have a vision, it is, and especially when I'm acting on that vision and serving other people, that is when things really work out. And for context, my work, functional coaching work, our approach is a trauma-informed approach, an emotional trauma-informed approach. And what's happening now is that the world is pivoting towards being more trauma-informed, and it's doing your emotional trauma work that is the thing that's usually missing for people. So it's not that you have a hard time manifesting or reaching goals. It's not really about limiting beliefs. It's not about any of that type of stuff. It's not about Mercury being in retrograde. It's really this emotional trauma piece. And if you're stressed, if you have anxiety, depression, if you ever have been through grade school, middle school, high school, college, if you have a soul-sucking job, if you have fights in relationships and you have a hard time resolving things, like all those things are sort of signs. If you have any mental health diagnosis, all those things are sort of a sign that you have some type of unresolved emotional trauma. And so many things can create trauma or wounding. And it's actually ironic that doing the trauma work is the like best cutting edge thing you can do to be a high performer. And what's interesting is, especially for entrepreneurs and especially for people who seek personal development processes and paths, the ones who are seeking the light are coming from something dark, right? And we all have it in different ways. And for me, I grew up, my mother wasn't supposed to have me. She had a broken back at the age of 13. She grew up in a very traumatizing environment emotionally and physically. My father was in Vietnam for 3 years as a medic on the front lines of, lots of trauma, and saw all kinds of really hard things to see. And then those two got together and had me. And my mom sort of defied the medical system. The doctor said, don't have a kid. And she said, screw you, I'm having a kid. And, the thing about me is that I've had this visceral knowing that my birth hurt her. Like I in the womb, like and in my life, I've had this feeling because it literally hurt her. It literally made her back worse. She's had 3 near-death experiences, 3 back surgeries. She's died 3 times in those surgeries. I mean, she's had a very extensive trauma history. And I've always grown up with this desire to sort of help her feel better. That's like how I was born and raised. So it also was at some point maddening because, you had to be 19, 20, you want to get the hell out of there. And so I did, and I went to Los Angeles and I became a manager in the music business. It became very successful very quickly. In like 21, 22, my title was Senior Vice President of A&R at Geffen Records, which is a very senior title for a 21-year-old kid just turning 22. And then I lost my dream job because of drugs and alcohol. And that put me on a personal development path. And, you get one book and then all the recommendation engines, even in 2001, are like, if you person who bought this thing bought these things, and then you kind of go down the rabbit hole. And I started sharing those things online back in the MySpace days. I started publishing things consistently online, and one thing led to another. The Daily Love became very popular. We had about 7 million readers a month, but then I killed it because I wanted to start to coach people. I didn't start the Daily Love for money. I don't do what I do for money. I do it because I want to make a difference and have something useful. And for the last 10 years, I've been coaching people very intensely for 5. And essentially, after a lot of curiosity, a lot of evidence-based approach of coaching, I've come to realize that everybody has trauma, and that's what's holding people back. And it's what they went through and how they held it and the relationships they have and the environment that they're in that matters more than affirmations and Mercury. So everything that I do is really trauma-informed. I have my own trauma that I've overcome and manage on a day-to-day basis. And that's what would help my clients do too. But that's a lifetime of context as briefly as possible.
Yeah. I can imagine. This is exactly why I wanted you to go through it, because there's so much there. But I think like every chapter, I guess you learned something along the way that pivoted you to in a slightly different direction. So, I mean, like you talked about your own trauma and how you eventually overcame that. Could you share some insight on like what that was for you and I guess some of the emotions behind that?
Yeah, so there's different, trauma is very misunderstood and not recognized. There's the very obvious forms of trauma. So we're talking combat trauma, we're talking abuse, neglect, sexual assault, these types of things. Obviously traumatizing, but there's other things that are traumatizing too. And one thing that's traumatizing that is very unrecognized is the emotional availability of the parents when you're a child. And not just the physical presence where like they're in the same room as you, but like, are they in tune with you emotionally? Because we have our whole nervous system is wired for emotional attachment. And we don't have a secure, safe emotional attachment to our parental figures. That disconnection is traumatizing. The technical term for it is neglect. Now you could have unintentional neglect. And for me, we were always focused on taking care of my mom because she had a broken back. So I was, quote unquote neglected because the focus wasn't on me emotionally, it was on her, which was well and good because obviously there's no like bad intention there. She's in tremendous pain, and at the same time my development was thwarted because I didn't have that same type of secure attachment that people view sometimes. So I had technically the emotional neglect, and that manifested itself into all kinds of disorganized patterns, into attention deficit issues, into defiance. It manifests himself in like drug use, and then basically anyone who would pay attention to me in a romantic relationship, like I'm like, oh, you'll pay attention to me, I'll date you, and then oh, you're doing cocaine, so I'll do cocaine with you, and that all creates a lot of crazy because you just don't deal with the underlying stuff, and next thing you know, you're 22, hitting rock bottom, going, what the hell just happened? And then at like 30, realizing it's a thing called trauma, and then okay, what's that, and how do I work on it? And so it's a process, and because trauma is still a very confusing topic, it's not discussed a lot, it's very misunderstood. People think it's just this sort of very egregious things, but it's actually far more subtle in most cases.
Yeah, I love that you touched on the point about like how we end up, following where we think the love is, copying other people, as you just said. And it's funny you say that because just yesterday on an episode, I was talking to someone else about how he used to be popular in school, and that wasn't him. It was a false sense of identity. And I thought back to it, and I thought, that's what I used to be like. And now thinking back, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, the reason that probably was happening intuitively, just understanding it, is that's what your definition of love becomes. That's what you think, like, oh, everyone's attracted to that guy or that girl, like they're speaking to him, so I better do what they're doing if I want them to be around me as well. And then you start to fall into this false sense of identity. And I'm sure you see it all the time with your clients as well, in some shape or form. So if someone's going through that now, they, feeling like, I don't feel like I'm popular enough or loved enough or don't have enough attention, how would you deal with that? Like, is there something, would you dig deeper to find out the underlying cause? Like, are there some questions you'd ask them? What does the activity look like, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So when you start to take attachment trauma, which is how we relate to each other, developmental trauma, which is what happened to you when you were growing up, relational trauma, which is the pain between people, which is a significant, and then also your current environment. When we start to, it's called that, taking all those things into consideration, it's called a trauma-informed approach. And with the trauma-informed approach, and you start to look at the latest neuroscience of how all those systems work together, what we're learning is that the common sort of personal development or spiritual lexicon of terms like limiting belief or false sense of self, and terms like that are actually inaccurate terms, because what we're learning is, human beings are mammals, and they're adaptive. Like, that's what we do, right? So the popularity is an adaptation to your environment, right? Becoming a podcast host or coach is an adaptation to my environment or your environment. So the first thing is to understand that there's no such thing as a bad response. There are only adaptive or maladaptive responses. Adaptive responses are functional. Maladaptive responses are don't work. And so what personal development folks might call limiting beliefs, right? I can't make money, or I'll never be enough, or whatever it might be. From a trauma-informed approach, what we start to realize is it's not limiting belief. That's a survival belief, because that belief helps me stay safe. It helps me live. It makes a lot of sense based on my history and what happened to me, how my previous relationships may or may not have ended, and the context that I've formed. When you really get into neuroscience, when you experience any type of trauma as a child, which we all do, the brain stops developing at that point, specifically the part of the brain that creates context or meaning. So we're talking about man's search for meaning. You got to look at your hippocampus and go, is it healthy? Because if I don't have a healthy, or if I have a non-developed hippocampus, I'm going to maybe create like a 5-year-old meaning out of everything that's happening around me, even though I'm in a 42-year-old body, right? So the first thing they have to understand is that your response, whether it's a belief or trying to be popular or whatever it might be, is a survival adaptation based on whatever you went through. So it takes away a lot of the guilt and the shame. Now, also understand that what people go through if they have a trauma is not an excuse for bad behavior. So you can't say, oh, well, Charles Manson had some childhood trauma, so let's let him off for those murders. Like, no, absolutely not. Or, so-and-so has trauma, so, the fact that they, abuse somebody makes it okay. Like, it's an explanation, not an excuse. But so what we have to start to realize is that if somebody has, sort of a need for attention, well, that's the recognition that we all need that. We all need attention. Like, we are social creatures, right? But the thing is, if you're trying to get attention, say, at being popular in school or being popular on Instagram, right? That's not really secure attachment. There's actually a movie that just came out on Netflix called The American Meme. It's a wonderful film about many influencers. And one of the big takeaways is that they're basically all depressed, right? Because they don't have true, meaningful, deep relationships. And so the goal is to start to look at, well, what am I trying to get from this? And I don't mind building a social media following. I don't mind, being known or what that type of stuff. But when you get that dopamine hit and that connection through those things, it is temporary and it won't last. But the value, the survival payoff for the individual is it's not intimate, therefore it's not threatening. It's way easier for someone to maybe share something online to strangers than to like the most meaningful person in their life, because the most meaningful person in their life could hurt them tremendously. Or like someone online, even if it's a negative comment, who cares, right? And so the search for connection through sort of shallow intimacy is something that most people go through. It's very common today. And what we can do is you can still build your platforms. but we want to start to do the work of, okay, but like, let's talk about the love you really want, the intimacy that you're really scared of, and why it makes sense that you're scared, and how we can help your nervous system start to feel safe getting the things that you want. So that would be sort of a general context to help answer that question in a broad strokes.
Yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. And just based off that, then, do you think everyone should do therapy work?
Well, it depends. I have a love-hate relationship with mental health models because the current mental health model, like standard, okay, there's rebels and there's people who are way out front, but the standard therapeutic model, especially in America, in North America, the diagnoses come out of a book called the DSM-5. The DSM stands for the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual for Mental Health Disorders. And you open this thing up and they basically give you a symptom cluster. If you have these 10 symptom clusters, then you're bipolar, or you're schizophrenic, or dissociative identity, or you're narcissistic personality disorder. The problem with the DSM is that the American Psychiatric Association, who made the DSM, rejects all of the mountain of evidence that developmental and attachment trauma is the root cause of the majority of the mental health disorders that are in the world today. And so the problem with that is that when you go get a diagnosis from a mental health care practitioner, if that's what you're doing, it's kind of like saying, like you broke your arm, right? And like, well, it's not that you have a broken arm, you just have an inflamed arm, right? Or you have a dissociated arm or something like that. But they're not willing to acknowledge the root cause of the issue for many reasons. And so I have a love for therapy. However, the therapists who are really getting the most results today aren't people who just go to DSM, give you a diagnosis, and then give you here's a medicine to take and, go about your day, right? Maybe we treat the symptoms with a diagnosis, but the other thing is that disorders are mislabeled. So it should not be called, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder. It should be called post-traumatic stress response, because it's a response to the trauma. You take multiple personality, now called dissociative identity disorder. If you take someone with multiple personalities and you put them in a place where there's a bunch of people with multiple personalities, they all seem kind of crazy, right? You take that same person in their family of origin, they are a brilliant, creative person dissociating from the trauma of their environment. And they realize the nervous system is so creative that it created multiple personalities just to cope. And so it's a different context. So what you want to do if you're going to go into therapy is you want to find a trauma-informed therapist who might use the DSM as a guide, but is not the Bible for them. And specifically, if you can find someone who does attachment-based therapy, it's going to be good for you. And if they use protocols like neurofeedback and EMDR, then you're going to be with somebody who knows what they're talking about. So they can say, you know what? Okay, I'll give you the bipolar disorder diagnosis for the insurance purposes, but let's do your attachment trauma work and get down to something in a deeper meaning. Now, functional coaching, what we do is we don't diagnose, but we do look at your history and understand how did you form attachments and what decisions did you make and what happened with your nervous system. We take that into context to help you move forward. But I do think that getting someone who's trauma informed on your team, who's attachment informed on your team, is a big deal. And please, please, please never believe that your diagnosis is a life sentence.
Yes. Yeah. I love everything you've just said, because I've had exactly a similar sort of realization with health, not mental health, but physical health in terms of disease and gut health and things of that nature. Because again, it's the same thing from the people I've spoken to and the research that I've had to be forced to do on my own. A lot of the stuff that shows up on your body that's not the life sentence, as you said. There's something deeper than that. And often it's misdiagnosed because for whatever reason, they're just reading from a textbook that they learned from university 20 years ago. They don't have your health at their best interest. There's so many things behind that. But when you do research, you realize, actually, I'm lacking certain vitamins and minerals. So my body's not nourished, it's undernourished. And then it's showing up as a disease. So you don't treat the disease, you treat the fact that you haven't got enough vitamins and minerals, and that comes through diet. So if you fix that, maybe you'll live a healthier life. So I'm making it sound simple, but there is so much research behind Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and how all of these things can be avoided if you have the sufficient vitamins and minerals over time in your diet.
If you look at the human body, right? The human body is seeking balance and health. right? So if you remove the blocks to it, it will heal. Now, I want to be clear. I'm not dissing therapists or doctors, because every doctor takes the Hippocratic Oath. The first rule is do no harm, right? So, but at the same time, all the data and research is coming out so quickly now, and it does take on average about 17 years for like a study or research to reach the mainstream, right? So there's this delay between when the research come out and when it becomes institutionalized. And so the people that you're talking to and the information you're discussing, it's well documented. It has not made its way into the standard processes yet. And you're talking about gut health. 90 up to 90% of the neurotransmitters that your brain needs to feel good are produced there. And so if you have dysbiosis in the gut, there's no way you're going to be able to feel good long term. Further, though, if your vagal pathways are blocked, which is the nerve that connects the gut and the brain and goes many other places, then even if you have the right supply, it's not going to get up there. And so what you have to understand about your approach to health, if you're listening to this, is that a lot of people are treating either your mental health or your physical health as if what your body is doing is wrong. Okay. And what we have to realize is what your body or mind is doing is a response to an underlying pattern of disorganization or disease. And when you get to the underlying pattern, then the body's response starts to make sense. And so we have to not simply just pathologize something and say, this is what's wrong with you. We also have to say, this is why what you were doing is right. Same thing with addiction, right? Addiction is a solution to a problem. It's not a very good solution, right? But there's a purpose to it. And so I think that having a significant level of respect for the body's responses to the traumatizing environment, be it inflammation or emotional trauma or physical abuse or soul-sucking job or, too much high fructose corn syrup, whatever it is, we have to have a lot more respect, I think, as a society in how our body is responding, because it's been around for millions of years. It knows how to adapt.
Exactly.
Far more than any journal that we could publish.
Most definitely. So I've heard you say as well, because as you were talking, I just remembered that science is the after effect of studying the spirit. What do you mean by that?
So that was my father is an interesting cat, because he's very scientifically minded, and I won't say he's an atheist, but he's a hardcore agnostic with an atheistic tilt. And it makes sense because he's been through a lot of trauma in Vietnam and in the war and seen some really hard things. But so I was raised as like hardcore science mindset. He's a PhD in biology. Like I was raised in all the ologies and scientific method and stuff. But I am woo-woo as hell on the inside also, because my mom is that way. So I kind of have this blend. And my mom also is very scientifically minded, masters in biology. But what I started to realize was, right, you start to look at like scientific breakthroughs, right, whether it's E equals MC squared or, Newton figuring out gravity or whatever, right? And all that's happening is that human beings' pattern recognition skill set is increasing. But this shit has been there the whole time, right? So it's not like Einstein discovered the theory of relativity as if he created it. He just identified that pattern, right? Newton identified the pattern of gravity, right? And so the idea is that like all of these patterns already exist. So what science is basically doing is saying, well, we don't know shit, so we're going to start to study things around us and start to notice patterns. And once we go get enough verification, then we'll say it's true. But it doesn't mean that shit isn't happening all around us all the time. That is literally mind-blowing. And the smaller you get into like, molecular science and neuroscience and how these like little tiny neurons work and all the peptides and stuff. Like, I think one of my favorite scientists in this category is Dr. Candace Pert, who like literally discovered the opiate receptor. She hypothesized many other receptors. She created peptide T, which changed and saved so many lives in the AIDS revolution. And she was a neuroscientist. Like she was like studying all the small particles of how all these things work. The smaller she got, the more woo-woo she got. And she was in the ivory tower of science until she started using a 4-letter word, which scientists reject, which is the soul. Because she got to a certain point where she's like, there's no way these things at this level should be able to do these things. Like something else is at play here. And like literally last week, there's a brand new study that comes out that shows that many of the very smaller particles of our bodies are sort of animated by electromagnetic fields. Now that sounds kind of like an aura. that sounds kind of like a spirit. So the smaller we get and the more we're able to identify patterns of the universe, essentially what's going to happen at some point, it's inevitable, is that we're going to figure out enough patterns to realize where the hell we came from, right? And how we got here, right? We're going to realize there's an ethereal realm, there's a subtle realm, and then it'll be like verified and it'll be no big deal. Until then, you're cuckoo and woo-woo. But I really think that, spirit, or whatever you want to think, the electromagnetic field that animates all things, however you want to refer to it, right? It's there, it's real, it's palpable, it's tangible, we can feel it, and science is just catching up to it. And so, scientists will eventually figure out what Buddha was saying all along, or Jesus, or fill in the blank. And once it's clinically verified, someone will try to find a way to probably make money off of it, which is a shame. But the point is that there's all these things happening around us because creation's amazing, and we're just piecing it together. And there's so much that we don't know, but eventually science will catch up, I believe.
I think that the only thing we can say we know is that we don't know. Like that's the best place to just be. Because
right. Well, no scientist can prove me wrong, so it's the burden's on them.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think the difficulty comes in because we're processing it through the five senses. And this realm that we're in is not limited to the five senses. It's outside of our five. There's stuff outside of that as well. So there's only so much you're going to be able to understand, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, if you take our dopamine addiction devices, right? These smartphones, right? You take a smartphone, and you put it, it's not on, it's a regular Wi-Fi. So, it's not in airplane mode. It's transmuting information all day that you can't see. Yet it still happens, right? So we already have devices that are connected via means that we can't yet perceive, and we take it for granted. Yet somehow we think that is only available for machinery, not realizing that we're organic machinery. So yeah, there's a lot that we don't know. But the field theory, a lot of the energy medicine work that Donna Eden is doing, all these things are very cutting edge things. But science, the smaller we get, the more we can study things at a deeper molecular level, the more we're going, yeah, there might be a soul.
Yeah, exactly. I think just for those who are listening at this point, you've explained a lot of the work about in terms of the functional life coaching and breaking down the fact that trauma is probably the underlying thing driving a lot of the behaviors and decisions we make. Are you able to give some real life stories of what's happened to people out there and how you've sort of coached them to overcoming that?
Yeah, the basic idea is that the father, or I don't know, the accepted father of psychology, American psychology, is a man named William James, who was at Harvard in the late 1800s. And James at the time thought that psychology was a soft science because there's so much that we couldn't measure like we can today. Now it's nowhere near a soft science now, but it used to be. And James considered it. But James's ultimate vision for the field of psychology, which I would now extend to the field of mental health and neuroscience and trauma and all that type of stuff, is for human beings to be able to make their nervous system their ally instead of their enemy, and help them achieve their goals and wishes and dreams and use their gifts automatically. That was James's vision. And so that's really what we help people do, is we help them look at their nervous system and how what they've done makes a lot of sense. And what starts to happen is they start to realize oh my gosh, this thing that I'm procrastinating on makes no sense. So example, we had a client once who came to us almost on food stamps, and she had a significant abuse history. And we started to realize that she wasn't putting herself out there on social media because she thought she would be hurt again by being visible and taking up space. But it wasn't just her that she thought this of. She thought it would also be true for her children. When she realized, as an example, that by not putting herself out there, the people who hurt her are still winning, right? All of a sudden, major paradigm shift for her. And even though it was scary to move forward, within 2 months, she was doing $50,000 months. $50,000 months, right? So because she started to realize oh my goodness, this unconscious survival pattern that I had, that's not entirely accurate. We had another client who, had a fear of being left by his mother, which many, many human beings have this fear, right? And when he was able to confront this and realize, he's going to be okay with or without her approval, and she didn't approve of his business, right? He said, with or without her approval, I'm going to move forward. And then that's when he broke 3 and started doing his $40,000 or $50,000 months too. So there's so many different examples. There's people who, literally have stayed sick because they think that they can only get love if they're sick, not well, so that they stay sick because that's when their partner will take care of them and stay. When they actually don't trust that their partner can take care of them if they're not well. So there's so many different examples of how this stuff plays out, but ultimately we got to get in there and kind of dig around and go, okay, what's going on? Why is it there? And okay, let's help you move forward in this way. And it's a fun thing to do. And it's really amazing when those clicks start to happen, because when you start to address some of these underlying root cause things, you see big life changes.
Yeah, I think it's like an invisible driving factor almost. So how can people recognize like that's what's driving them? Like, do they need a coach, or how do they know when?
Well, if you're a human being, it's driving you. That first. So am I human? Yes. Okay, then I have trauma driving me. But symptoms like anxiety, depression, by being bipolar, any diagnosis, a soul-sucking job, having a hard time earning or receiving or keeping funds, having a lot of relationship issues or tensions or stuff like that. If you're very polarized in your beliefs, right? So I'm right, everybody else is wrong, whether you're any side of the table. If you blame people, if you're like, it's their fault and you can't see your side in things, there's so many things that create trauma, but all of those things need to be resolved on the underlying level. If you have a hard time, if you've never posted on social media, but you want to, maybe you started a business, but you're kind of like 50-50 where you're like in it, but not really in it, you're still at your job. If you're in it, but you're having a hard time sustaining it, if you get really shiny penny and you have a hard time focusing, like all those things are sort of signs that you have emotional trauma that needs to get addressed on the underlying, underneath all this type of stuff. And so the goal is to do the work and then to build the resilience, and not have triggers in the future, but to be able to navigate them and get through them a lot faster.
So let's get specific. I think a lot of people will be able to resonate with that, because there's someone out there listening right now who's experiencing one of those few things, or has experienced it in the past. But like, one of the interesting things I heard you say before is like jealousy is, I think you said jealousy is untapped potential in yourself. That's basically what it is. So can you expand on that? Because when I heard that, it's really a shift in terms of understanding that emotion.
Yeah, I believe that every phenomenon in the human psyche has a purpose, right? So it's not like random, okay? So jealousy is an example of that. So people are like, oh, I'm jealous of so-and-so. So like, let's just pretend for a second that like you really want to be in shape, right? And you're jealous of someone who's a 6-pack, right? Well, you're probably not jealous of someone who's 400 pounds overweight, right? You're jealous of the person with a 6-pack because they got what you want, right? Or the money or whatever it might be. We're not jealous of people who don't have the things that we want. So we can actually look at a phenomenon like jealousy through a more functional lens and say, you know what? Actually, there's a purpose to my jealousy because that person has something that I want. I'm going to own that. And then instead of being jealous of that person, I'm going to turn them into my friend and mentor and learn how they got that shit so I can get it too. Right? Like, that's the smart thing to do. And so, whenever I feel jealous or envious or any of those things, I do a little bit of an inventory, and I'm grateful for those people because they help me move it forward.
Yeah. I think that's a really good way to deal with that emotion, because so many people just get stuck in the anger bit of it. Like, this person's got that, so I'm just going to hate on them. And then it's just a downward spiral from there with your relationship with all the individuals that you see in your life that come up in that regard. So I think before going into like some final few questions, I think one of the other interesting things you said was like hitting an external target is basically us trying to hit an external goal. Is we're trying to hit an internal target almost. So if you can expand on that a little bit and how that can help change the way they see goals.
Yeah. One of my friends spent a year and a half trying to get on the New York Times bestseller list, stressed their way through it. And they got it. And they were happy for 3 days, right? And then they weren't happy after that. And so the lesson in that is every goal we have, weight loss goal, New York Times bestseller, money, you name it, we want those goals because there's an emotional payoff, right? We want the emotion that goal brings us. So if we can start to understand what emotional targets we're trying to hit, then we have to ask ourselves, A, will this actually bring it to me long term? And B, will the process of achieving this also bring me that goal? Right? Because I want to stress myself to peace or lack my way to abundance. I want to joy myself to joy. I want to excite myself to excitement. I don't want to stress myself to excitement. I want the process to be just as fun as the outcome, because life is really just living in the process anyway. So yeah, it's an important thing to realize that most people's physical goals are a representation of an internal goal and that they haven't recognized.
Okay, so you finished that, but as you were saying all that, you said life is living in the process. I think you just said it so casually, but to other people, like the light bulb would go off, because that is what it is. There isn't, you can't wait to live until you get somewhere. It's now. So
yeah, the horizon thinking,
yes. So how did you come to realize that? Because you've been through so much yourself.
I don't know. I've always just sort of, I was born with a sense of urgency. So I wish I had a better answer than that. But yeah, I've always had a sense of urgency, and I have a high toleration for things being unresolved. So I don't need to have things resolved, which I don't know if that's always good, but it's good sometimes. So yeah, I just start and I go, and that's just how it is. And everything's a process, and when the process is over, you die. So like trying to get to some final idea of something is futile, because you're always a work in progress.
Yeah, most definitely. Do you think there's anything like beyond that when you cross that finish line?
Oh, it has to be.
Do you have any crazy woo-woo theories on that?
Oh, who knows? I think the book to read on that is Journey of Souls by Michael Newton. He goes pretty deep into answering that question, but spirit world, some type of ethereal architect of all these things, but the multiverse and personalized experiences based on what your soul needs to learn, like something like that sounds about right.
So with everything you've been through, what would be some of the life lessons you'd want to pass down to the next generation of thinkers coming up?
I think a few things. Number one is, it's not about what's wrong with you, it's about what happened to you. And I think it's about really making an earnest attempt to do your trauma work, and to realize that your trauma is not your fault, but healing it is your responsibility. I think it's a really important thing to understand. I also think that understanding that you can't do it alone. With social media today and technology, there's a lot of isolation. You think following somebody on Instagram is co-regulation or being together, and it's not. We are social creatures. And so I think, really being intentional about who you're spending time with, and, making your day-to-day environment of relationships and where you live and where you work and where you breathe and where you eat and what's around you and all the signals and signs that you take in really are matching who you want to become, right? Because it's really difficult, if not impossible, to outthink or, use affirmations to overcome an environment that is the opposite, right? And so, really tending to your environment, cultivating some really awesome relationships, and doing your trauma work, I think is really some of the best stuff you can do for the next generation. Because with that information, once that becomes normal, I can't wait to see what people do. It's gonna be awesome.
Yeah, I think once it becomes a bit more accepted as well, because I have thrown around that idea in conversations, like with some of my friends, and it's just like, I think they're a bit resistant to it, because they have this stigma of like, oh, I don't need to like do therapy, or I don't need any work done. Like, what do you mean, sort of thing. So it's just overcoming that and realizing actually there's a lot of layers that are built up until now to make you who you are today. And so maybe if we look back and address some of the stuff that you've brought with you, or that have made you who you are, you could change the trajectory of where you go next.
Yeah, not just that, but also your family, because all this stuff is passed down in our epigenetic expression of the family. So you can absolutely turn genes on and turn genes off, and trauma has a lot to do with that too. So there's generational trauma. There's a lot of different elements here, and when you talk about being a multidimensional being, this is part of that too, right? It's not just spiritual in nature. We're in these bodies, and these bodies have a lot of pathways and mechanisms inside them that we're discovering. And people who think they don't need trauma work, it's more about understanding that it's by doing the work that you're going to get the life that you want. And if you're stressed, if you have anxiety, if all those things I talked about, then you got to do it. Otherwise, if you feel peace most of the time, if you feel joy most of the time, and you don't get triggered by your family in the holidays, then maybe not. But other than that, you probably got to do it.
See, a crazy thing is actually I went to see like an acupuncturist and a 5 elements healer. So I went to get her perspective on what was going on with me. And one of the things that she shed some light on, and I'm just wondering if this is something you speak to your clients about or comes up in conversation, is like what your parents go through, especially if you're the first child in the family. Their trapped emotions and feelings can get passed on into your body without realizing, and it could show up as pain or some type of suffering that you don't even know is happening.
Yeah. Yeah, that's directionally accurate. Carl Jung said, or probably one of his most profound quotes, is the greatest burden a child bears is the unlived life of the parent, right? And so it's way more than just trapped emotions. It's like the expectations, it's the life they didn't live, the dreams they didn't live, it's the rules they didn't abide by. There's so many things that could happen. So it's more not just a trapped emotions. It's like the unlived life that parent lived and how they managed that. And even if the parent loved them, right? There's a lot that goes into that, because children, pay far more attention to what you do than what you say. Right. And so they model your behavior, not your words. Right. So yeah, it's a big deal. And so the other thing to understand is that, people sometimes just say, well, I'm the first person in my family to go to college, right? As a very proud marker, which is something to be proud of. To be the first person in your family to do your trauma work is something to really be proud of, because that stuff gets passed down generationally until someone decides, I will be a transitional character in my lineage, and the cycle stops with me. And that's really, 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 really hard to do. It's really hard.
I was going to say
one of the hardest things.
Yeah, from what you're saying, that was going to be my exact next thing that I was going to say was there has to be one. There has to be one guy or girl that says it stops here. I'm going to recognize this, become consciously aware, and then not pass it on. And
that's right. I mean, like literally, it's easier for Elon Musk to build some shit to go to Mars than to do his trauma work around his father. Like literally, it's easier for him. So, so that's how hard it is. Okay.
Yeah, so I really do hope people take some value away from this and start to think about that for themselves in terms of where they can go should they have the courage to face it and talk about it and do it and take.
Well, the thing is it might sound scary at first, but the thing is that like the benefit is way better later, right? Because like the other option is to live with it, and that sucks, right? Why would you live with it if you can transform it? These are brand new discoveries. A lot of the research is just coming out this year. Even the Polyvagal Theory, which is probably my most favorite topic to talk about. That shit was published in 2011 and 12. So it's like brand new. It's not stuff that's been around for a long time. And so this is an emerging field. And if you're not doing your trauma work, you're behind the times, right? Like if this was 2011 or 12, and you're like, if you're not on Instagram, you're behind the times, right? And then, man, I wish I could have been on Instagram back then, right? If you're not doing your trauma work, you're behind the times too. That's how you want to think of it.
Most definitely. So just to get into the final few questions then, with the crazy journey you've been on and all the ups and downs you've had, is there anything different you'd speak to the 18-year-old Mastin?
Like if I could go back and give him advice?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's hard though, because, then you get especially if you take a look from a spiritual perspective, it's kind of like, that was my journey. But I would probably tell him to slow down, even though he wouldn't listen, and to really get into his body and notice how he's feeling, and to be able to, underneath wherever his complaints or frustrations are, to help him identify what he needed instead, right? So instead, because below every complaint is something that you actually need. And so the goal for young Mastin might be for that, because, and the other thing I would definitely tell him that your baseball injury is bullshit and you should go play for the majors because the doctor was fucking wrong. I would also tell him that. And who knows what would happen then. But for sure, helping him get more into some of his body work and understanding his attachment patterns would be a big piece of. I'd probably coach him for a year.
No, so I hope those who are listening out there, like around that age group, and even guys and girls that are above that, like, you know, take that way and hopefully can implement that at a younger age, and so that, you know, when they grow up, it changes the way that they're approaching certain things. So the second question is, if there was one statement that you could write by yourself that goes into a time capsule for generations from now to read, what would the one statement be?
Oh my Lord. The line from Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure comes to mind, and I don't know why. But yeah, Bill and Ted does a movie from the early '90s with Keanu Reeves, and they were these two like teenagers who were sent to save the world through their music and guitar and stuff like that. And they were like totally like stoners and stuff like that. And their like mantra was like, "Be excellent to each other," you know. And I think that pretty much sums it up.
No, I love it. It's short and simple, and just changes the way that you interact with people. So the last question is, with everything that you've been through and everything that you're going to go through, living a long, healthy life, what would be the legacy you want to leave behind?
I would like to be the person who helped stop emotional trauma in my lifetime.
I love that.
Like, some people want to end polio, some people want to put a rocket on Mars. Like, I want to stop unnecessary human suffering.
You seem like a highly compassionate individual, like intuitive, compassionate, like you genuinely love people. Like you don't want to see them in pain.
Well, you know, it's hard to see people in pain. And, you know, Louise Hay, one of my mentors and friends, and God rest her soul, has a great quote. She said, you know, when people deserve love, or when people need loving the most, they deserve it the least. Right. And I think that, you know, when you understand why things happen the way that they do, and you understand this trauma perspective, I definitely, you know, have my moments. But it's more like, hey, actually, this is what's really going on. And, you know, I just want to help. That's the goal. Because when you realize, like, you know, people aren't in control as much as they think that they are, their nervous system hijacks them, and then the environment and all the things that goes into why people do why people do what they do. It's hard to get like you can be frustrated or angry when there's like injustice, right? But even within injustice is underneath all that is trauma, right? So it's like there's certain injustices that should be off the world. There's certain values and it should be extinct. And the human beings who are perpetrating all those things have trauma. So if we can heal that, so many other things will get resolved. So yeah, it's hard. You can't judge the things that you're trying to help. You know, you can't judge the things you're trying to help.
I love that, man. And you've dropped a lot of wisdom, you know, in your journey so far, and especially on this episode. So I know people are going to love this. Where's the best place for people to find you, to follow you?
Oh, awesome. Well, it's at Mastin Kipp on all the things, you know, Instagram and all that jazz. And then in terms of the book, you know, I have a free coaching program that goes along with the Claim Your Power book, which walks people through this whole process around functional coaching. And that URL is claimyourpowerbook.com. That's where you can find it.
Awesome, man. I'm going to link all that stuff in the description as well. And
awesome.
This was definitely worth 6 months because people are going to go away thinking about things very differently. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it, man.